السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا محمد قائد الغر الميامين، وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. الحمد لله. In our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah, we have, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reached the section on Ziyarat al-Qubur, on visiting graves. And this is a completion of a very logical journey in looking at the rulings related to funerals, right? Because we looked at what happens before the person dies, at the point of death, as we prepare them to be washed, then shrouded, then hastening to pray over them, then carrying them to burial, then the burial itself, then what you do after the burial, and the ta'ziyah and the aza and the adab related to that, outward and inward. And then you have, um, then after all of that, now, once someone is buried and the immediate unfolding of the burial is taking place, then you have the next component, which is the section on visiting the graves upon someone's being buried, right? And this is one of the issue. This is a fascinating areas of, from a legal perspective, because this is one of the texts where one of the key texts related to visiting the graves of the explicit command of the Prophet ﷺ, has both the nasikh and the mansukh mentioned together, right? The um, the the abrogated text and the abrogating text are mentioned together, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, كنت نهيتكم عن زيارة القبور فالآن فزوروها. I had forbidden you from visiting graves, now do visit them. And the hadith is in Sahih Muslim and elsewhere, right? The hadith is in Sahih Muslim and elsewhere. So this is um, now initially it was prohibited to visit graves, right? And there are several explanations for why. Amongst them, a very simple explanation, which is that early in Islam there was no one to visit because there are no believers yet, right? That's one of the reasons, right? And secondly, because of the reality that initially there was a ta'sis of tawheed, of making clear the rulings of tawheed, and then after that tawheed was very clear, then there came the encouragement, right? To visit graves, right? There came the encouragement to visit graves, right? And a book that should become an accompaniment to the seeker of knowledge is Mishkat al-Masabih of Mullah Ali of At-Tabrizi, and the Sharh of Mullah Ali al-Qari. Of course, in Mishkat al-Masabih, in the section on Janaiz, there is an extensive section on Babu Ziyarat al-Qubur, right? With the many hadiths related to that, right? So the hadith in Muslim, right? And there's a few other components related to the hadith, right? To this, and there's many adab that are understood, right? Right? And And as usual, Mullah al-Qari has many beneficial points um, related to to that, so you can see, right? And there's the different things one says and so on. It's a good habit to connect with the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And here, of course, Imam um, At-Tahtawi has extensive commentary, right? We're not going to go into all of it, but there's a lot of points of benefit. Right? So he says, so قال الإمام الشرنبلالي رحمه الله ندب زيارتها, right? It's recommended to visit them. فصل في زيارة القبور. Section on visiting graves, it is recommended to visit them. من غير أن يطأ القبور, without stepping over graves, right? Now, it's not haram to step on a grave, right? So it's sunnah to avoid stepping on graves. But also practically, right, in graveyards, it can be difficult. So it's the sunnah that one takes the means to avoid it, right? 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 And you can see the details in. But where it's, and then they say that they could well be karaha if it's readily avoidable, right? Where it's readily avoidable, so there's an actually defined grave, right? And you step on it deliberately, that is imtihan, right? Imtihanul qabr, that is disrespecting the grave, right? But often if the grave's flattened, etc., it becomes difficult, and you need to get to the grave that you're visiting of a relative or one of the righteous, whatever. So that's why they say, without stepping on the grave, and this is the ruling, right? Standing on a grave deliberately without strong need is seriously makruh. للرجال والنساء, right? So it's recommended for both men and for women. وقيل, so the recommendation of visiting graves in itself, in our madhab, in itself, right, it's recommended to visit graves, i.e. it's recommended sunnah for both men and women. وقيل تحرم على النساء, and it is there. It is said, this indicates the lesser strength of that opinion, that it's not allowed for women. والأصح أن الرخصة ثابتة للرجال والنساء. But the more sound opinion is that the dispensation is affirmed for both men and women. The dispensation, meaning, why? Because the original ruling was impermissibility. And then the command, الآن فزوروها, applies to men and women. للرجال والنساء. فَتُنْدَبْ لَهُنَّ أَيْضًا, so it is recommended for them as well, على الأصح, according to the more sound opinion. Right? Right? And those who mention the impermissibility, they say it returns to fasad and fitna, right? Fasad and fitna. Fasad related to their own conduct. People would go and wail and mourn and do things that are not permissible, right? And fitna, in that people would go in large groups, right? And there'd be mixing and so on. And there'd also be many ignorant festivities. In many places, the visiting of graves, and it's surprising, but not so surprising. In many cultures, there's all kinds of, not just religious problems with people's visitation of graves, but socially, right? That people would go to graves, and then a lot of people go to graves, and people would go beg at the graves, and it'd become a whole show, right? And then there would be other things, right? There are all kinds of innovated practices around the graves. And as shocking as it, there'd be prostitution rings around graveyards. There would be, all kinds of crazy things, right? But in itself, it is permitted as long as it does not relate to personal impermissibility, right, of people going and being, in a manner that they're going to be wailing and mourning and so on. And there's no societal fitna. That the dignity and decorum is upheld, right? Right. So that you see what Shurunbulali mentions, and likewise after going through the discussion, right? Right, you see very insightful words from As-Siraj. وفي السراج, this is As-Siraj al-Wahaj, Sharh al-Quduri of Imam al-Haddadi. And then Imam al-Tahtawi closes the section, right? And he says the sounder opinion is that the rukhsa is affirmed for both men and for women. And you see, the Sayyidah Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha would visit the grave of Sayyidina Hamza radiallahu ta'ala anhu every Friday, for example, right? And he gives other, and Sayyidah Aisha used to visit the grave of her brother Abdurrahman in Mecca, right? And other such texts, right? As long as it's done soundly, right? And depends. There are some places where, honestly, I'm not going to name countries, so I don't want to single anyone, where, like, what happens around graveyard is like a madhouse, especially when a lot of people go, right? And other places where there is dignity and decorum, and and that depends, right? But you see, fiqh is فهم ما دق منه. It's الفهم الدقيق والتطبيق الدقيق. It's subtle, understanding things with subtlety and applying it with subtle precision. Not, the faqih is not a butcher; they're a surgeon, right? وَالسُنَّةُ زِيَارَتُهَا قَائِمًا. The sunnah is to visit it standing, if able, right? Right? And there are adab related to it. There's some really useful points, right? Tahtawi mentions here that he quotes from Sharh al-Mishkat of Mullah Ali al-Qari, that it's befitting that one stand close to the grave, standing, right, if able, or sitting, right? 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 So it's superior to stand if you're able. But like, if someone's elderly, whatever, you don't have to force them to stand, right? Right? So this is زيارته قائما عند القدرة على ذلك من غير مشقة, right? If able to, without hardship, right? And one visits them, they say the adab with visiting them is how you would visit them when alive, in the sense that, the sunnah is that you stand facing حذاء وجهه, facing the face of the deceased. So you'd actually give your back to the qibla, and because the deceased is facing the qibla, so you would stand facing the deceased, right? This mentioned, right? And the Tahtawi has lots of excellent things there, right? And it's good to notice the books that different authors rely upon. And also you see Sharh Shir'at al-Islam is mentioned here. He has many good adab. Sharh al-Mishkat, Mullah Ali al-Qari does a brilliant job, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, on this, right? Right? And Mullah Ali al-Qari says that after quoting the various hadiths related to it, he says, from these hadiths there's dilala, clear indication that it is recommended when one greets the deceased to face them and to continue like that in one's dua. One's making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? But it's like, if Sidi Hamza and I are sitting over lunch and then I ask Sidi Hamza, could you make dua? So he's making dua facing me. He's not making dua to me, he's making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thinking that a believer, just by facing somebody, is praying to them, right? That's su'u dhan, right? Right? Like, if I was Sidi Hamza and someone accused him of, like, okay, if someone accused me, if I'm facing Sidi Hamza and I made dua and said, oh, were you praying to Sidi Hamza? I would take them to court. I probably wouldn't, but my nafs would want to take them to court. That's ta'addi ala al-Muslim, right? Because saying that someone is a fasiq is less bad than to say that they're a mushrik, right? So that's criminal, right? And you can see. Right? Okay, so that's زيارتها قائما والدعاء عندها قائما, also to make dua when standing if able. كما كان يفعل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في الخروج إلى البقيع, as the Prophet صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم used to do when he went out to Baqi', the main graveyard of Medina. Of Medina? And say, Assalamu alaikum dara qawmin mu'mineen. Peace be upon you, O abode of believing people. Wa inna insha'Allahu bikum lahiqun. And we, by the leave of Allah, will be catching up with you. We're proceeding forth to join you. As'alullah ta'ala li wa lakumul afiyah. I ask Allah Most High for myself and you, afiyah, wellness. And afiyah is to be free of all harm, And inshallah, we can share there in the sharh of Al-Fasi on Al-Hizb Al-Kabir. There's an amazing discussion, and also Izmiri, both of them. They have amazing discussions on Al-Afiyat Al-Tamma, what is complete wellness. فَالدِّينِ وَالدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ what is complete wellness, right? Which is to be free of harm in any way whatsoever, right? وَيُسْتَحَبُّ لِلزَّائِرِ, right? So when we say Assalamu alaikum dara qawmin, right? Peace be upon you, O abode of believing people, right? Of course, but what you mean is, O people of the abode, right? As is obvious, right? And that other narrations make that clear. Tahtawi mentions that. Okay. ويستحب للزائر قراءة سورة ياسين لما ورد عن سيدنا أنس رضي الله تعالى عنه أنه قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من دخل المقابر فقرأ سورة ياسين, يعني أهدى ثوابها للأموات خفف الله تعالى عنهم يومئذ. And the completion of the hadith is يومئذ العذاب ورفعه, right? Where does your method stop, Omar? Okay, good. Right. So, because Sayyidina Anas relates, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, whoever enters the graveyard and then recites Surah Yasin, meaning recites it and donates its reward to the deceased, Allah will alleviate for them any punishment on that day and lift it, right? And وكذا يوم الجمعة. And this falls under um, the broader, the broader call of reciting Yasin for your dead, right? That is the asl, the strong asl in the Sunnah. The other narrations, they have what they have of potential issues within them, such as this one. And the takhfif and the rafa diminishes or raises is according للتنوع الحال, because of different states, right? Um, right. So there's merit in reciting Yasin for the dead, but being in the presence of the dead to do so has clear benefit as well. وكذا يوم الجمعة. And likewise on Friday, يرفع فيه العذاب عن أهل البرزخ. Likewise on Fridays, punishment is lifted or alleviated for those of the barzakh. ثم لا يعود على المسلمين. And then it does not return for the believers on that day. Right? And that's come. But this aspect that that believers are not punished on Friday, Mullah Ali al-Qari dismissed this. He said that there's no sound evidence for this, right? And the basis of matters of the unseen, and all the matters of this, the ghaib, are only established by naql, by transmission. Wallahu a'lam. Right? وكان له أي للقارئ بعدد ما فيها. And the reciter will have, to the extent of what there is in it, حسنات, of good deeds. رواية الزيلعي من فيها من الأموات, of the number of the deceased in it, in terms of rewards, because you can, when you recite, you can intend one or others, right? And that the basis of ihda' al-thawab, as Imam Ibn al-Humam summarized the principle that the basis for the believer is that anything that you can do for yourself, you can donate its reward to another, whether an individual or a group, whether living or dead. Right? وعن أنس رضي الله تعالى عنه أنه سأل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال يا رسول الله إنا نتصدق عن موتانا ونحج عنهم وندعو لهم فهل يصل ذلك إليهم؟ فقال عليه الصلاة والسلام نعم إنه ليصل ويفرحون به كما يفرح أحدكم بالطبق إذا أهدي إليه. Right? And this has significant weakness. Right? راه أبو حفص العكبري, that Messenger of Allah, if we give in charity on behalf of the deceased and perform Hajj on their behalf and pray for them, will the reward of that reach them? It's related that he said, والسلام, that yes, it reaches them and they rejoice in it, as one of you rejoices if a platter of food is gifted to them. Right? That's related. So here, of course, we've mentioned it before, but it's good to remember that there are things that really are part of one's personal reading. They're not technical subjects per se, but from our responsibility to reflect on the hereafter, we have Imam al-Haddad's Sabilul Iddikar, right? the path of heedfulness, um, and which is an important, an amazing work. Um, and there's, the lives of man, and those of you know Arabic by now, you can and should be reading it in Arabic. It's a brief but amazing work. There's Imam al-Ghazali's Kitab Dhikr al-Maut, right? Um, and we covered that in about 8 classes in the Revival Circle, right? And that could be a useful accompaniment. Um, but there's also an amazing work by Sheikh Abdullah Sirajuddin called Al-Imanu bi'awalim al-Akhirah, faith in the worlds of the hereafter. But on most topics, if you go to Riyadh al-Salihin and Mishkat al-Masabih, right, you find related chapters and read them, particularly with the commentaries. Dalil al-Falihin of Ibn Allan on Riyadh al-Salihin, and likewise Mullah Ali al-Qari's Mirqat al-Mafatih, right? And other such books. Kitab al-Adhkar with Ibn Allan's commentary. There's also Mullah Ali al-Qari's commentary on Al-Hisn al-Hasin. These books have a lot of the adab al-shar'iyya. And these things one cultivates gradually. So, and the ulama, they say يتساهلون في الأحاديث الضعيفة. Right? The ulama are easygoing when it comes to weak hadith, especially the things that are already the key asl is known, and then they'll quote. And if you want to look at, for example, one of the most brilliant of the great imams of hadith, after Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, is his most impressive student in the science of hadith, Imam al-Sakhawi. And Imam al-Sakhawi, in his work on the hadith on sending blessings on the Prophet al-Qawl al-Badi', it is replete with weak hadith. Right? And he points it out, and that's it. Right? But in our times, if hadith like that are quoted, all one needs to do is say, well, this is related, and the basis of this is such and such hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's it. So then Imam Shurunbulali mentions this principle that Ibn al-Humam and others made tahrir of, right? Right? And this is explained brilliantly by Imam al-Tahtawi, and he mentions about at least 10 proofs that yes, you do have other than the reward of your own actions, right? Because a lot of people take the verse وَأَلَّيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى, that no person shall have anything but what they strived for. There's I think he mentions 8 interpretations of it, right? But one of the things is the company you keep is from your striving, right? But that the person only has from their own efforts what they strived for, right? In terms of reward. But there are other ways that they're rewarded as well, right? Right? And others said that it's abrogated because there's later hadiths, later verses that explain it, or it is conditioned, or it's specific, right? Another interpretation, the insan in this hadith refers to the disbeliever, and that's the opinion of some of the early Muslims, right? Or that a person only has, meaning only deserves for themselves what they did. But that's tariq al-adl, but tariq al-fadl, bab al-fadli wasi', right? And there's other interpretations. Anyways, so he says, فَلِلْإِنسَانِ أَنْ يَجْعَلَ ثَوَابَ عَمَلِهِ لِغَيْرِهِ عِنْدَ أَهْلِ السُنَّةِ وَالْجَمَاعَةِ صلاة كان أو صوما أو حجا أو صدقة أو قراءة للقرآن أو الأذكار أو غير ذلك من أنواع البر، ويصل ذلك إلى الميت وينفعه. قاله الزيلعي رحمه الله، قاله الإمام الزيلعي رحمه الله في باب الحج عن الغير، أي تبيين الحقائق. So a person can gift the reward of their actions to another, and when you gift it, this is not the person gifting it doesn't lose the reward. Gifting the reward is like dua. Oh Allah, grant what it means is grant the like of the reward of this recitation or this act to so and so. You're not annulling the action from you, because you're asking the most generous, right? You're asking the most generous. And this is a type of tawassul bil a'mal, interceding through one's works, and that by consensus is legislated, right? So of any actions, but there's a difference between gifting the reward and acting on behalf of another. You can do hajj anil ghayr, right, with its conditions, but you can't pray on behalf of another, i.e. fulfill their duties on their behalf, right? وعن علي رضي الله تعالى عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: من مر على المقابر فقرأ قل هو الله أحد 11 مرة ثم وهب أجرها للأموات أعطي من الأجر بعدد الأموات. رواه الدارقطني. And it's related from Sayyidina Ali that the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said that whoever passes by the graveyards and recites قل هو الله أحد 11 times and then gives the reward of that to the deceased, they will have the like of the reward of the deceased, right? Right? وأخرج ابن أبي شيبة عن الحسن أنه قال: من دخل المقابر فقال اللهم رب الأجساد البالية، اللهم رب الأجساد البالية والعظام النخرة التي خرجت من الدنيا وهي بك مؤمنة، أدخل عليها روحا منك أو روحا منك. Right? It's with the fatha. It can also be with the dhamma. Right? وسلاما مني أستغفر الله استغفر له كل مؤمن مات منذ خلق الله آدم عليه السلام. Right? So, and Ibn Abi Shayba relates from Al-Hasan, yani Al-Basri, that he said, right? So this is meaning from the words of Sayyidina Al-Hasan, that whoever enters the graveyard and makes his dua, O Allah, Lord of these bodies that have decomposed and these bones, right, that have become divested of their flesh, that left this world in a state of belief in you, grant them a ruh, which is grant them mercy and comfort, right? Grant them the wind of mercy. Ruh is a a gentle breeze that gives comfort, relief, and mercy. وَسَلَامًا minni, and greetings from me. Everyone who had died since the time of Adam alayhi salam would seek forgiveness for them. This is related by Ibn Abi Shayba, right? And the things with the reward, right, is to consign the reality of the reward to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Simple. You don't need to complicate. If you try to do accounting on the reward, you get, you say there's great reward. How? Like how much forgiveness will they seek? How will they seek, etc. Right? We know that the believers, Allahumma, we say Allahumma khfir lil muslimina wal muslimat, al ahya'i minhum wal amwat, the living and the dead. Right? And when you intend the living, the ulama say, you always, the asl in dua is to magnify. You don't just intend the living now. What's the problem with making dua for those in the future? Any problem with that? Right? So, right? So they've already sought forgiveness for you, right? It's a matter of you'll attain more of that forgiveness, right? Because you made dua for somebody, right? The angels say, may you have like the like of what you asked for, right? So all of it, if the spiritual accounting of it makes sense. How much and how? Some of it we understand, some of it we don't, right? But don't be hasty. That's too much, right? وأخرج ابن أبي ابن وأخرج ابن أبي الدنيا رحمه الله بلفظ كتب له بعدد من مات من ولد آدم إلى أن تقوم الساعة حسنات. And Ibn Abi Dunya relates it from Al-Hasan that they'll be recorded for them to the extent of those who died of the offspring of Adam until the final hour comes of good deeds, right? ولا يكره الجلوس للقراءة على القبر في المختار. It's not disliked to sit at the grave, on the grave, to recite according to the chosen opinion. لتأدية القراءة بالسكينة والتدبر والاتعاظ, in order to be better able to recite with stillness and reflection and taking heed, right? And this is one of the big errors when people make in donating reward, right? You're not donating your recitation, you're donating the reward. So these are three of the key adab of recitation, right? To do the recitation with sakina, serenity, tadabbur, reflection, and itti'az, and taking heed from what you're reciting. أفلا يتدبرون القرآن, right? And there's a lot of basis for this, right? There's a difference between standing at a grave, walking on the grave, and sitting on the grave, because where else are you going to sit? The grave, in the graveyard, the graves tend to be packed closely together, right? So in a typical Muslim graveyard, there's typically not a lot of space for you to go put a chair, etc. So if someone, and there's many examples of this. Imam al-Tahtawi mentions a number of them. Right? Right? Now there's many points of benefit in Tahtawi, but he quotes Imam Badruddin al-Aini from Sharh al-Bukhari, which is one of the great works of Islam, right? And one of the things that a lot of lax Hanafis just they just stop studying, right? And radiallahu ta'ala anhu, Imam Badruddin al-Aini, who had a lot of him, wrote probably the largest, one of the largest books of history, right? In the history of Islam, of the history of Islam. And it used to be said that it's that a complete copy is not available. The Dar al-Makhtutat of the Seeker's Guidance Project, they've got a project underway to edit the whole Tarikh al-Islam. I forget what the title of it. They found, for a long time it said there are no complete manuscript copies. They found at least 6 to 8, I think, full copies, and several almost complete copies, right? Some from the time of the author. Anyways, so Imam Badruddin al-Aini, one point is that he relates that walking on the graves is haram. That's not the position of the madhab, right? Unless it's understood, the walking on the graves is haram when done out of disrespect to the grave, right? And Imam Tahtawi, rahimahullah, makes that clear, right? And the other things, sleeping in the graveyards, etc. It's all makruh, not haram, right? And And he relates it from Imam al-Tahawi, but then he mentions a point of benefit, right? He said, this is an important fa'idah, right? فإن الطحاوية, for Imam al-Tahawi, هو أعلم الناس بمذاهب العلماء, right? Right? And Imam al-Tahawi wrote important works on that. And Imam al-Tahawi, of course, his uncle was al-Muzani, who was the teacher of, who was the student of Imam al-Shafi'i. Imam al-Tahawi was originally Shafi'i. His uncle was al-Muzani. And initially, al-Tahawi was very slow in his learning, etc. And he would read a lot of the books of Muhammad al-Hasan, and he would ask a lot of Hanafi kind of questions to al-Muzani. So he was kind of distracted in his Shafi'i studies and busy with the work. So Muzani got upset with him and said, nothing will come of you. And out of self-dignity, he left him, became Hanafi. And then it's said that he said at the end of it, he said, were my uncle to have lived to see this day, he would have had to break his oath. But this is important, right? That he is the most not who أعلم الناس. This is not مطلقا. أي من أعلم الناس of the madhahib of the fuqaha. And he wrote in اختلاف العلماء famous works, which Imam al-Jassas abridged. لا سيما مذهب Abi Hanifa, and particularly in narrating the position of Abu Hanifa, because not all the opinions of Abu Hanifa are found in Zahir al-Riwayah, right? Okay. And, and of course, not everything that Tahawi relates from Abu Hanifa is the final narration, which is why, we go to the earlier books through. There's a whole history, why circumvent 1,000 years of great scholarship, right? There are pathways to that. Okay. Right? So Mullah al-Qari in his Sharh al-Muwatta of Imam Muhammad, which is a brief commentary, right? Compared to, the Muwatta of Imam Muhammad, right? Which is Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan's narration of, the Muwatta of Imam Malik, right? But he added about 20-25% of his own narrations to it, where he disagrees with Imam Malik. The Muwatta of Imam Muhammad has multiple commentaries on it. One of the briefer ones is Mullah al-Qari, but it's easy to overlook that. Just because it's brief doesn't mean it's not worth it, because he's one of the great fuqaha and muhaddithin of the later Hanafi school. There's an extensive, primarily legal commentary by al-Kamahi called al-Muhayya ala al-Muwatta, and this is published in 4 volumes. And then there's a commentary of Imam Abdul Hayy al-Lakhnawi called At-Ta'liq al-Mumajjad ala Muwatta al-Imam Muhammad, which is published. There's a Dar al-Qalam edition, and that's the one I would recommend. And if you can find the Dar al-Qalam edition that retains the introduction of Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, that is particularly useful. There's a bit of a falling out between Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda and the editor, Sheikh Taqi al-Din al-Nadwi. So for a while, Shaykh Abdul Fattah's introduction disappeared. But if you can find it, please, the Ta'liq al-Mumajjad of Imam al-Lakhnawi ala Muwatta al-Imam Muhammad, very beneficial work. And we will, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, be covering that. I've taught it a couple of times. Sheikh Mufti Mahmoud Ashraf Usmani and others highly encourage that. So we taught it a couple of times in Amman. And Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, of course, he wrote it. Sorry, Imam al-Lakhnawi wrote it when he was 25. So he's a little bit opinionated in it. That's excusable. He was young. Right? So the permission of sitting at the grave is established. That's the summary of what he mentions. And he says, وَكُرِهَ الْقُعُودُ عَلَى الْقُبُورِ لِغَيْرِ قِرَاءَةٍ. It's disliked to sit on graves for other than recitation, or حاجة مثلها, or if there's a need like of it, right? But it's not prohibited, right? And it would appear that this karaha is of tanzih, right? Right, from what? Right? If it's not out of disrespect, as Mullah Ali Qari says. If someone's tired, there's nowhere else to sit, they sit on the grave, that's like qira'ah, there's a haja mu'tabara. لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم لأن يجلس أحدكم على جمرة فتحرق ثيابه فتخلص إلى جلدته خير له من أن يجلس على قبر. Right? For one of you to sit upon burning embers that would burn their clothing till it reaches their skin is better for you than to sit on a grave. This is sit on a grave. It's it's understood to be i.e. disrespectfully. Right? So that nahi is mu'allal bil ihana. Right? وكره وطئها بالأقدام لما فيه من عدم الاحترام. And it's makruh to walk on them, right? With your feet, because of what it entails of disrespect. That's deliberately when avoidable. Right? And if it's done out of disrespecting the grave, it will be makruh tahriman. If just someone's being lax about it, there's makruh tanzihan. It's right. وأخبرني شيخ العلامة محمد بن أحمد الحموي العلامة محمد بن أحمد الحموي الحنفي رحمه الله تعالى بأنهم يتأذون بخفق النعال. Says, and I was informed by my sheikh, the Allama, the notable scholar, Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Hamawi, the Hanafi, may Allah have mercy on him, that they are distressed by walking on them. Now the Hamawi family, of course, Hamawi is a big, Hama has been one of the great centers of learning, right? You have Damascus, Aleppo, and the four of the great cities of knowledge in what is modern day Syria, Damascus, and I'm using واو العطف, دمشق وحلب وحما وحمص, right? The واو is لمطلق الجمع because لا تفيد الترتيب, because it depends who you ask, right? Right? Because the people of Damascus said the fada'il of Sham apply to Damascus, right? But the people of Halab say that, Sayyidina Ibrahim came from our lands, and this and that, they have all these things. And they'll say, look at the Hanafi madhab. Right? Where did all these great Hanafis come from? Right? The Damascus, they have a word Dimashq. Sayyidina Isa will land here. Okay? Will descend here. And of course, if you listen to the Ahl Dimashq, you think that there's no other opinion about where Sayyidina Isa will descend. Okay? But our opinion is that he'll descend in Jerusalem, etc. Right? Anyways. Now, Al-Hamawi produced some great imams, right? They Sayyid Ahmad al-Hamawi, right? Right? And it's one of the, and he had migrated to Mecca. Right? Can you grab that? تعليق. right? So, right? So Sayyid Ahmad ibn Muhammad, what do you have? Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Hamawi, right? 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 Correct? Hmm. Right? So it would be good to check. Okay. Um, now, because Imam Shurunbulali died in the year 1069, right? So the greatest of the Hamawis, right? The greatest of the Hamawis, yani the Hamawis who are ulama of the madhab, of the authors, the madhab known as al-Hamwi, is al-Imam al-Sayyid Ahmad ibn Muhammad al-Hamawi al-Makki, who wrote Hashiyat, the Hashia on Ashbah wa Nadair, and he also wrote, um, what else did he write? He wrote a Hashia on Mullah Miskin, wrote numerous beneficial treatises, also wrote a Sharh on Manzumat al-Aqaid of Ibn Shihna and others. Um, his father, Muhammad al-Hamawi, and his grandfather were great scholars. So I don't know if this Muhammad ibn Ahmad may well be, we can double check, may well be the father of Sayyid Ahmad al-Hamawi, the great author. But we can double check that, inshallah. Right? And one of the ways to see in the biographies of Maulana al-Shurunbulali, which is the Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Hamawi that he took from, right? The Makhlutat say Muhammad ibn Ahmad as well. That may well be, I'm not sure. May well be the father of Sayyid Ahmad ibn Muhammad Makki al-Hamawi. Right? And Sayyid Ahmad al-Hamawi narrates in his Hashia on Mullah Miskin from his father's ta'liqat or something. And they're like Muhammad ibn Ahmad, Ahmad ibn Muhammad. It's quite interesting. Anyways, وقال الكمال وحينئذ فما يصنعه الناس ممن دفنت أقاربه ثم دفنت حواليهم خلق من وطئ تلك القبور إلى أن يصل إلى قروبهم إلى قريبه مكروه. So he says, so therefore, what people do when one of their relatives was buried, and then around them other people were buried, that they'll walk on all those graves until they reach the grave of their relative. This is makruh. It's makruh, yani tanzihan. Unless, and with the added disrespect, it could well be tahriman. Right? مكروه في نفسه ومع قصد الإهانة قد يكره تحريما والله أعلم. Right? وقال قاضي خان ولو وجد طريقا في المقبرة وهو يظن أنه طريق أحدثوه لا يمشي في ذلك وإن لم يقع في ضميره لا بأس بأن يمشي فيه. Right? If one finds a path in the graveyard, and if one thinks that it's a path that they've just randomly cut, i.e. that there may be graves underneath, then one should not walk on it. Meaning one should still try to strike a course as best one can without takalluf that would avoid walking on graves, right? Why? Because in a lot of graveyards, because very often the problem of being in any area of human activity is you get desensitized to others in that human activity, right? Like in hospitals, technically people are there to cure the sick, right? But people do all kinds of things. Why? Even to the sick patients, because he's got desensitized. Let's get on with it. Likewise, there's a graveyard, right? You're doing a great khidmah, but when people lose a sense of purpose and intention, they sort of just, they just get sloppy. Right? Okay, there's crowding. Let's just make a road this way, and whatever. And that's just afatul insan. But if one doesn't think that they just cut it randomly without consideration, then there's nothing wrong with walking on it, right? And that returns to the urf. Some places these things are properly governed, and other places they aren't, right? وَكُرِهَ النَّوْمُ عَلَى الْقُبُورِ. It is prohibitively disliked to sleep on graves, right? وكره النوم على القبور وكره تحريما قضاء الحاجة أي البول والتغوط عليها. And it's prohibitively disliked, or even worse, right, to urinate or defecate on graves. بل وقريبا منها, and even close to them, right? Why would someone do that? Someone got stuck in the graveyard, right? So they say, oh well, let's just relieve ourselves there, right? وكذا كل ما لم يعهد من غير فعل السنة. And likewise, all other things that are not understood to be from the sunnah acts related to the grave, right? Sit and have a meal at the grave, right? So someone visits, they're deceased, so they sit around and they put a table spread that says, Khalo, wish you were with us, right? And you put a table spread on top of it, etc. Some of it will be makruh tanzihan, some of it would be makruh tahriman, right? وكره قلع الحشيش الرطب وكذا الشجر من المقبرة, right? It is disliked to pluck living grass, and likewise plants, right? And shajar is not just trees, right? Shajar is kullu ma yanbutu bisaq, anything that has a trunk, right? So bushes would be considered, in classical Arabic, would be considered shajar, right? From the graveyard, right? Now this is min ghayri haja wala maslaha, without need and without interest, right? Because if you just especially in places where there's rain and so on, right? If you were, so this is just to pluck it without need, right? But to keep the graveyard, like, you keep the grass cut, etc., right? For the purpose of, otherwise يتأذى الناس, right? So this is من غير حاجة ولا مصلحة. لأنه ما دام رطبا يسبح الله تعالى, because as long as the grass or the plants are alive, they glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فيؤنس الميت, right? So they grant comfort to the deceased. وتنزل بذكر الله تعالى الرحمة, and mercy descends with the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's difference. Do cut plants glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well? Right? Because the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? 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 And the hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari, right? Which Imam Tahtawi quotes, right? That the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam took a palm frond and split it into shaqqa jaridatan nisfain, wada'a ala kulli qabrin nisfan, put half the palm frond on each grave. right? And he'd mentioned each of these two people were being punished in the grave. And he said, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, إِنِّي لَأَرْجُو أَن يُخَفَّفَ عَنْهُمَا مَا لَمْ يَيْبَسَا, like as long as they don't become dried, right? Um, so now putting a plant on a grave, the ulama differed. Is this exceptional to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, etc.? There's ikhtilaf amongst the fuqaha on it, right? Um, so putting flowers on a grave or etc. There is a basis. Now there shouldn't be wastefulness, right? Now some places there are practices that the ulama respond to differently, right? And one needs to be aware of that, right? In some places, like you go to a graveyard, and around the graveyard are all these florists, right? And poor people, and like roses are expensive, right? So you have like it's considered like disrespect to the dead if you don't take rose petals and sprinkle them over the dead. And some people just literally go to the graveyard, take rose petals, sprinkle them over the dead, and walk away. And it's not been right. So that's almost like a, and of course, usually most people do more than that, right? But the rose petals, oh, that's making tasbih for the dead, right? Now there's a basis for it, but you know, someone took, but especially to make takalluf, right? That is one thing that's done incidentally, but there's less like someone's going to go every time you visit the grave, you buy $50 worth of flowers, put them on the grave, give $50 in charity on behalf of the deceased, right? Right. So but does it have a basis? Yes. If it entails israf or neglect of the primary sunnahs of visiting the grave, then that's a separate matter, right? But someone takes some plant, puts it on the grave. Some of the mashayikh say if you take something of, like, if you have plants in your house, take something, put it on the grave like that, but without takalluf. They don't need decoration, right? And the decoration they get is not the decoration of flowers on their graves and so on, right? Um, right? And other forms of takalluf, right? Some people go and they put oud on the grave. Right? So, I want them to smell good smells. They're not in this domain anymore. The rules there differ. What you donate to them is dhikr, is Quran, dhikr, dua, right? Sadaqa jariyah, things like that, right? Um, and there's some discussion on how does this connect with the Quranic verse وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ from Surah Al-Isra, right? And what is the nature of that tasbih? There's ikhtilaf. Imam al-Ghazali said that tasbih is by its state, by its iftiqar ila Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is its glorifying God. Others said no, is a tasbih haqiqi. And then there's all kinds of speculative investigations related to that. And he says, وَلَا بَأْسَ بِقَلْعِ الْيَابِسِ مِنْهُمَا. There's nothing wrong with plucking dried grass or plants. يعني الحشيش والشجر, and shajar, as we said, is anything that grows with the trunk. لزوال المقصود, because the purpose is not fulfilled. Right? So now here Imam al-Tahtawi quotes from Sharh al-Mishkat, right, of Mullah Ali al-Qari. And sometimes if you notice in a chapter, somebody's quoting again and again from a chapter of a book, it should convey to you that, oh, that chapter is likely quite useful, right? And there's a lot of, Mullah al-Qari really does a beautiful job on this chapter, right? That some of the later scholars of our school said that the habit of placing rayhan, the basil plant, right, or jareed or palm frond on a grave, that some of them said that it's a sunnah because of this hadith. وإذا كان يرجى التخفيف عن الميت بالتسبيح الجريد فتلاوة القرآن أعظم بركة. Said, but if you seek that the deceased benefit from the tasbih of a plant, then the recitation of Quran or our tasbih and dhikr is far greater in blessing. And then there's an amazing section that Imam Tahtawi quotes, but we will leave that, about the adab of related to someone in distress and they're seeking to end their life, right? And there are some really, really good points in there. So he says, what does he say? It's disliked to wish for death because of difficulty or distress, right? Or harm, right? Because it is a type of objection to destiny. But if one is overwhelmed, there's the dua of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allahumma ahyini in kanat al-hayatu khayran li wa tawaffani ma kanat al-wafatu khayran li. Allah grant me life as long as life is good for me, and cause me to die as long as whenever death is better for me, right? But the asl is قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم خيركم من طال عمره وحسن عمله. The best of you, right? خيركم من طال عمره وحسن عمله, right? The best of you are those whose lives are long and whose actions are good. And they say, in the thing is that there's of the many lessons in the hadith, it takes a long time to make one's actions good. Like it's a lifetime quest. So ihsan, right, is a ghaya bila nihaya, right? It's an end without end, right? And he also has other right? And then here is a very useful point in Tahtawi, right? He says, وقد انتهى ما رأيته من كتابة العلامة المرحوم عبد الرحمن أفندي خلوات، فإنه كتب متنا لنفسه وشرحه شرحا واسعا احتوى على فوائد وفرائد ونقول غريبة، وقد رأيته مدشوتا وخفت على ما فيه من الضياع لعدم إقبال الناس عليه من شدة الاحتياج إلى ما فيه، فأحببت أن أقتطف بعضا من أزهاره على هذا الشرح المتداول بين الناس لأجل أن ينتفع المسلمون ولا يضيع سعيه. فإنه مكث المدة المديدة في تحريره وتنقيحه فجزاه الله تعالى أحسن الجزاء ووالى عليه جزيل الرحمات. Right? This is one of the other things that is ignored, right? That Imam al-Tahtawi here mentions that here the footnote, the comments of Abdul Rahman Afandi Khalawat on, right? So he wrote a matan and he wrote a very vast commentary on it that has all kinds of points of benefit, but he was, his copy, right? He was feared that it'd be lost because people did not seem to have pay much attention to it. So, but there's so much benefit in it, so he put a lot of what is in it into his commentary. Let's see if we can find it. And so he asks for dua for him, right? And then فَمَنْ كَانَ دَاعِيًا لِي وَمُتَرَحِّمًا عَلَيْهِ فَلْيَدْعُ لَهُ. So whoever says makes dua for me, make dua for him. for Abdurrahman Effendi Khalawat, right? And he says, and this is why it's so amazing. I've seen multiple editions of Tahtawi, usually disastrous, right? They say, and some even, and other people writing about Hashir Tahtawi, and it's evident that they've not bothered to read it carefully, right? So most of them, and there's people, like, honestly, they say, yeah, alhamdulillah, I studied, I've been teaching, there's someone's been teaching Maraqi for 20 years, and they're not familiar with Sharh al-Sayyid. I said, so who's the Sayyid that's mentioned in Tahtawi? Right? Because, a lot of people are just slackers, right? Or they're just busy with, all kinds of things, right? So what does Imam Tahtawi say? It's one of my favorite parts of the text, right? So this is the adab, right? يعني من لا يشكر الله من لم يشكر الناس, right? He says, so whoever make dua for me, so make dua for him, for Sidi Abdurrahman Effendi Khalawat. ويترحم عليه, and seek mercy for him. وعلى المؤلف, and upon the author, Imam Shurunbulali. والسيد أولا وبالأصالة, and to make dua first and foremost to a Sayyid, because that's like the primary, that's the primary reliance of Imam al-Tahtawi, right? Is the Sharh of a Sayyid, and then Imam Shurunbulali himself, right? ثم يذكرني بعدهم بالتبع والطفالة, right? And then mention me after them, in following them, and التطفل, I'm just a child in front of them, which is not fair. Imam Tahtawi was the foremost Hanafi of Egypt of his time, right? And he's a great scholar, right? فإنه ليس لي في هذه التقييدات إلا ما كان خطأ. Says, I don't have in these taqeedat, in these points that I've made, right? Except errors. Of course, that's not, this is his looking from the vantage point of his humility, because it's a great work. أما ما كان فيه من صواب فمن المنقولات. As for anything correct in it, it's from what I have quoted from. It says, وأسأل الله تعالى أن يغفر لنا العثرات. آمين. إنه بيده الخير. Indeed, in his grasp is all good. وهو على كل شيء قدير. والله سبحانه وتعالى أعلم. And Allah Most High knows best. وأستغفر الله العظيم. I seek Allah's, the tremendous, forgiveness. That's an amazing. That's akhlaq al-ulama there, right? Right? رضي الله تعالى عنه. Right? And they say بذكر الصالحين تتنزل الرحمات. Once after Maghrib, there's a dars of Hashit ibn Abdin at the Umawi, and with Shaykh Abdul Razak al-Halabi. So Shaykh Abdul Razak would sit on this big chair, and facing him, so he'd be facing the people, and then the halaq would have 25 people, right? There'd be a bunch of ulama there, and some tulab al-ilm. And surprisingly, not that many people would attend, because there's not much commentary on it, but there's a certain tertib to it. And sometimes some awam would come and sit against the wall, but nobody would dare. Normally the awam would sometimes ask Shaykhi, but not in the dars of Shaykh Abdul Razak al-Halabi, because you knew that he has this laser gaze that would make senior scholars go silent. So suddenly, from the door of the Qibla, Sheikh Adib Kallas came in. Okay? Of course, everybody, the dars stopped for a moment. So Sheikh Muhammad Juma looked up at Sheikh Abdul Razak al-Halabi. Sheikh Abdul Razak nodded. Because it was eye communication, because he just looked up and he looked towards the door. Sheikh Abdul Razak looked and he nodded. So Sheikh Muhammad Juma got up, and he'd have one of those wooden things for his copy of Hashit ibn Abdin, but he's lower, Sheikh Abdul Razak sitting on the kursi tadris. So they went, him and Shaykh Faraz al-Nimir, who now teaches from that same place, subhanallah, at the Umawi. He succeeded Sheikh Abdul Razak there, got a chair for Sheikh Adib. Sheikh Adib refused. He went and sat well behind Sheikh Muhammad Juma. And people said, no, no, tfaddal. He just looking down, totally hunched over. Although Sheikh Adib would sit straight, totally hunched over. And he said, لا, طالب العلم لابد يكسر ركبتيه. The student must break their knees. And he just looked down. So then Sheikh Abdul Razak said, let's continue. He shook his head like a couple of times. After the dars, Sheikh Adib got up, and he'd been sitting for whatever, half an hour, 40 minutes. It took him a bit to get up. He was late 70s or however old he was. And so people went to help him, and then they went to kiss his hands. The Sheikh Abdul Razak got up, and Sheikh Abdul Razak was actually bent over. So he walked like he was like almost aqrab ila ruku'. So he's walking to the side room. So he looked like he was like in acceleration mode. And he walked fast despite his hunched over. Okay. So a lot of people went because Sheikh Abdullah is going straight to his room, right? He didn't like to be interrupted. Sheikh Adib was just getting up. So people went to kiss his hands, and Sheikh Adib put his hands up. Zubda hunik. Right? Like hunak. Right? He says the cream is there, right? Pointing at Sheikh Abdul Razak. Right? He says, أنا طالب علم. I'm just a طالب علم. رضي الله تعالى عنهم أجمعين. يوزن مداد العلماء ودم الشهداء فيترجح دماء العلماء أو مداد العلماء. Okay. Then we're going to look at أحكام الشهيد بإذن الله تعالى. After we pause for Maghrib. So we'll come back and finish Kitab al-Salah بإذن الله تعالى. So we'll be back in 10.